Hey, welcome back. Chapter 5, Lecture 2. I realize as I'm planning ahead to this chapter that some of these lectures are going to be a little longer. Some of these topics are topics that when I'm in the classroom, I will spend a whole class talking about them, rather than that 20-minute with a break and then 20-minute. So there may be fewer lectures in total that you see in the list for this, but the lectures will tend to be a little bit longer. And it's just sort of how things flesh out. Sometimes it's hard to know how to do something sort of quick. Now this one, though, might be a quick one. And it kind of connects to what we just talked about. And it's also, again, I'll try to use these lectures to kind of keep tying strings together as you're learning about psychology as we go through. So let's jump into this one. Gestalt Psychology, lecture 5-2. Gestalt, by the way, what a strange word, huh? So those Germans, they like to create words for that capture things that most other languages never create a word for. And so sometimes there are these German words that are extremely hard to translate into another language. Gestalt is one of them. I'm gonna give you a sense of it now, and then by the end of the lecture, hopefully it'll make more sense. But to the extent you can translate that word, the closest we can come in English is a phrase that we use, and the phrase is, "The whole is more than the sum of its parts." Okay. Every now and then, and we might, if you're a sports fan, you might think of this as like a team. A team has individuals that all have individual talents. What will make them a great team is if those individuals can work with each other in such a way that the team ends up being more than the sum of just those individual parts, right? So that they work together in what some people might call a synergistic way to create something that's more than the ingredients that went into it. Okay, so right now you're like, what the heck does that mean? That's okay. A little bit of ambiguity and confusion at the start, and then let's kind of make sense of that term as we go through. I also will continually try to reconnect things both to the brain, as we kind of did in the last chapter, but also to the history of psychology, so that you kind of have this sense of how all these parts that you're learning about fit together in the grander story of psychology. So I want to start here, actually, and I want to start with this guy, Sigmund Freud. I told you a little bit about him in chapter 1. And one of the things that I want to stress here is that there was a psychology pre-Freud, and that psychology was very experimentally oriented. So think of Wundt, think of others like that, and they were very interested in creating a psychology that was as scientific as physics, chemistry, etc. And so they were working a lot by getting their methods really precise and just trying to get good data. And of course, there were issues about that. So we talked about introspection and whatever, but they were trying their best to kind of study the mind in a really nice scientific way. And then along comes Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud, not being an experimental psychologist, he's a medical doctor. And suddenly he decides to focus on what we would now call mental illness. Nobody prior to Freud was really focusing on mental illness. They were just trying to understand us, right? Experimental psychologists were just trying to understand how humans work, how we do the things we do. Freud was the one that really said, okay, I'm going to focus though on these people who are having challenges that I think are psychological in origin. And he came up with his whole psychoanalytic theory, wrote a bunch of books. I've told you a lot about this already, talked a lot about sex and aggression at a time when people didn't talk about sex and aggression. And he became very popular. And in fact, he kind of started to reshape how people thought about psychology. They started to think of psychology in clinical psychology terms, which many of you guys may have before you came to this class. That might have been your first thought of psychology. This shocked and horrified the experimental psychologists. This was not what they wanted. Freud was talking about things that couldn't be measured, that could not be studied scientifically. They were just ideas, thoughts that he had, and so they were kind of more like philosophy, right? And psychology was trying to be more than that. They were trying to embrace an empirical approach and really kind of start with philosophy, but then add the experiments and the science and the rigor, and that was really important. So when Freud did his thing, experimental psychologists were not happy, And there were reactions, and we see separate reactions in America and in Europe. In America, a lot of the experimental psychologists that were working then embraced behaviorism as a response to Freud. And you already know a little bit about behaviorism. We're going to talk a whole lot more about it. We'll have a whole chapter on it. But behaviorism was really about being as scientifically rigorous as possible and not talking about anything you couldn't study scientifically, focusing on things you could directly see and measure. And so that was one reaction, the experimental psychologist saying, no, not what Freud is doing. Here's the real science of psychology. Okay. And we'll talk about that again. We'll have a whole chapter on it. What we're going to talk about now, and to some extent is a theme of this chapter, but we're going to talk about a very specific reaction. The experimental psychologists in Europe, remember, psychology began in Europe, right? And it was very strong in Germany and other places, but especially in Germany, there were a lot of experimental psychologists, and they also reacted to Freud. They also wanted to be scientific, have that scientific contrast, but what they did is kind of, I'll say, retreated here. But remember back in the days of Weber, I talked about Weber before psychology was even born. Weber was doing those experiments with the weights and showing these mathematical relationships around just noticeable differences. Remember all that? That seemed really scientific. In fact, some people say that's why psychology was able to be born, was because of some of those examinations of how we perceive the world. And that's what Weber was about, right? Putting weights in your hand or different brightnesses of lights and then saying, when do you see a difference in your mind? When can you detect a difference? And so he was studying perception. And a lot of psychologists said, that was the way we had it. We were kind of doing the right thing. Let's go back to something like that. Okay, and that's what a lot of, I say, the European and especially the German, Gestalt is a German word, and it really did reflect the reaction the German psychologists had to it. Okay, so what is this Gestalt psychology? So first of all, I just want to connect it back to what we talked about last lecture. This process of the brain trying to make sense of the world, despising chaos and creating order. The Gestalt psychologists were kind of like, yeah, that's what we're kind of interested in. How does it do that? And I've talked about things like uses memory. And so memory is part of that story, but there's more to that story. And the Gestalt psychologists were looking for basic principles of perceptual organization, or a term they eventually called grouping. So the consideration is this, just like this Dan Brown quote says, we have all this information coming at us, sights, sounds, smells, and even with the sights, you can think of all the different things that could be impacting your eyes. When I look forward right away, I see a microphone here, I see a computer screen, I have these little glasses that are on my computer screen. I don't know why or where they came from. I blame grandchildren. I have my little headphones over here. These all seem to me to be distinct things. The microphone, the monitor, the glasses, the headphones. How does our visual system know what goes with what? Okay, and that's what it's called grouping, that these things all go together to be called the microphone. And that this all belongs together as a set of glasses. And so even though I go and I put it on my monitor on the corner, it doesn't feel like it's suddenly become part of the monitor. It still feels like a separate thing. How does the brain do that? How does it take all this chaos and group it into things which it can then try to recognize? Okay, and so they went looking for these, what they're called principles or Gestalt laws. Okay, remember Weber's law? They want to go back to laws and just like Newton, all that kind of stuff, because it's that like, we're scientists. Let's be scientific. So here's some of these laws, or sometimes principles. They're called a number of things. And I'm going to go show you a few examples. We'll talk a little arbitrarily about them here, but then we'll talk a little more specifically about how some of them kind of play out in real life, I guess. So good figure. If you have a bunch of things in the world that together create a nice single entity of some sort, then they will tend to be grouped. So if they create a figure, a nice symmetrical, even figure here, then all of these will be viewed as going together. Again, you'll see some of these in play, but let's just talk about them this way. Similarity. Okay, if we have a set of items like this, we're going to tend to see these ones as going together, these ones as going together, and these ones as going together because they look similar. We're not going to tend to see some odd line in this way kind of pop out. We're going to see this one pop out, right? Because this is the one that so items that are similar get grouped together. And so it feels like that's a thing. And now this must be a thing, and now these must be a thing, right? And so again, it's using similarity to kind of start tearing apart all of that information that's there. Closure, the principle of closure. You sort of saw another example of this previously, but let's go back to this one. This one is really striking because when you look here, you really feel like there is a line there, right? It really feels like this rectangle on top is a grayer color than the background. It's not. Now, how can I convince you of that? Well, let me see if we can convince you of that. I'm trying to think, how much can I zoom in on this thing? I'm going to make a complete mess of this slide, and it won't work for anything anymore. Even when I see it like this, I'm trying to zoom in enough so that we can actually see the line and it doesn't look gray. I'm running out of room to zoom my... hang on. I'll start here. I'll make it real big. Now we're going to get in trouble. Oh, boy. Now let me put that near the middle and let me zoom in. This is just me causing trouble now. Okay, there we go. Where is this thing? Where is it? It was over here somewhere. Now I've moved it to... come on. There we go. Okay. It's you still see a sense of a gray line there, and I'm even sort of challenging my perceptual, like, are you sure you didn't stick a gray box on top of that? I want to blow it up a little more. I want to blow it up. Why does everything move when I blow it up? It doesn't have to move. That's like irrelevant. Whoa. Okay, I'm just about to stop this crazy experiment. Wow. Okay, to me that perceptually looks like... So the idea here is supposed to be that when you just set up these Pac-Men so that all their mouths kind of line up, that creates a sense of what we're going to call good continuation, of something that this shape forms, and then we start to see that thing even though it's not really there. Okay. I have just completely messed up this slide. I have made it completely useless to use. Let's see if we can shrink it down to some manageable part where I can actually get to the corner of it anymore. There we go. You have to make those noises when you have to shrink things. It's the only way that makes sense. I have no idea where my slide is now. All right, so, there it is, I guess. Hey, all right, look at that. Get up here a little bit. Excellent. Let's go back to this. Cool. Oh. Not quite cool. It's still way too big, somehow. There we go. Okay, now we're talking. Okay, fine, that's great. Do that. Good. So there we have the closure example. Some of these other ones, proximity. So if we have 3 lines, but you just put that gap between them, now these ones seem to go together and these ones seem to go together, right? Sort of the opposite of this to some extent. Stop that, Mac. Stop it, Mac. Good continuation. We could see this as 4 lines. One that starts here, one that starts here, one that starts here, one that starts here. We tend to see it sort of as 2 lines crossing, or we see it as a cross, we call it that. But we feel like this line continues right through there, and this one continues right through there. I might have said continuation here, by the way. I should have been better at saying this is closure. When the set of elements actually create a shape that makes sense, then we close that shape. This is good continuation. That when something, and an example of this, by the way, would be like if I take this water and have a drink, which I kind of want to do right now. This is now in front of my face. right? And so if we didn't see good continuation, it's like part of my face is now sort of missing. It's kind of like that thing I talked about standing behind the lectern. But instead, we think the face kind of continues. Even though we can't see parts of it, we like to assume that if there's a sort of symmetry on either side, that it continues through the part we can't see. Okay, and then finally here, it's not finally, you're going to hear about a couple of other ones here, but that the object tend to be perceived as symmetrical shapes that form around their center. If you have symmetrical shapes around a center, this is a really horrible sentence, you will tend to see them go together as two halves of something. Okay, so big picture here. What the Gestalt people are saying is, okay, let's deal with this core challenge. This is a core challenge of psychology. How does the brain figure out what out there is a figure, is something, and what is just background? So that's sometimes called the figure ground problem. And it does that by grouping things in various ways. And when things get grouped, they become an object. And that object we then try to recognize. So they thought the very first thing psychologists should be doing is trying to figure out how this grouping happens. And that's why they started looking at these principles. Let's talk a little bit more as we go through. And so this is just a memory thing. It's really the same thing I've talked to you about before. It's just a diagram that some people like to use to remind stuff. Closure, we see this as a G, even though there's parts missing, because we want to close the G. Right? We kind of have seen things like this, and memory is going to be playing a role here. We've seen things like this in the real world, and it would make sense if this was just a G. And so we can kind of see something like it's occluded, but we still see this as a G, no problem. We see this as an E, even though really it's a bunch of boxes, some of them half black and half gray, but because of the proximity of certain things and the similarity, oh my goodness. We see that as an E. Sorry. Every now and then this Mac goes back and forth on slides, and I know it's something I do. I haven't quite got it figured out what it is I'm doing that's causing this. My brain is a little slow picking that up. Good continuation. Again, here we see this as a continuing thing, weaving in and out of the S. We don't see just a little nub over here, a little nub over here, and stuff in the middle. The brain wants to see this as a single object continuing. These two could get grouped together because they're similar shape, similar look to them. Figure and ground, tree within the letter A. So the idea here is one of the figure ground, just to understand the figure ground problem. When you read this as Gestalt, you're seeing this as an A and an L. And that spells Gestalt. It all makes perfect sense. But when you see this as an A and that is an L, the A is what we call figure. It's the foreground, right? And all the white stuff is the background. But if you suddenly look just in the middle of the A here, you can see a tree. And as soon as you see that tree, what's happened is your visual system has flipped figure and ground. It is now seeing the white as the figure. This is now the object. And that black that used to be the A is just the background. Okay, and so this is just a good example of the challenge the brain has when it's exposed to something. It has to figure out what's figure and what's ground. And sometimes that depends on the problem it's trying to solve. If it's trying to read this item, then the A is the figure. But if it's like find the tree, if you're playing find the tree, then when the people find this, the A is the ground. Okay, so just to show you how complex visual stimulation is and the challenge the brain has to make sense of it. Okay. Here are some normal examples. I'm still trying to figure out why I gave you this one. We'll come to that one. But here's a sort of common example. Like these are kind of common sense things, and you can take them to a higher level. So for example, when you look at this, if I ask you, who here knows each other? Let's group these people in terms of pre-existing relationships of some sort. Well, it's pretty easy for us to say, we think these guys know each other. We think these guys might know each other, maybe. And we think those people back there might know each other. So we would group this as sort of 3 pairs of people. What are we grouping based on? Part of it's proximity, but notice, by the way, that she's closer to her. Well, is she? Is she? sort of. But you can also we're going to talk depth perception in this chapter a little bit. These people seem further back than these people. So she's actually, behind this person. So really, she's probably closer here in proximity. But the visual system has to figure out the depth perception to do that, right? These people are really far behind everybody, and they look the same too. So proximity looks the same. And with these two people, I said this was maybe, we're not sure, and that's in part because of the distance they're apart. But here's why, and there's another Gestalt principle that I like. It's called the principle of common fate. Sounds really deep. But it's kind of like when we see an image like this, we can almost imagine the motion that's going on, right? So we could almost imagine a video that would have this as a frame, so to speak. And in that video in our minds, which is fueled by our pre-existing knowledge, right? Fueled by our memory, these people are walking along, so they'll be advancing kind of slowly. These people will be advancing much quicker. As will those people, because they're on bicycles. And so partly we can kind of see that movement. And because they're moving together, we group them together. In fact, a critical thing for these two, we can't tell in the static image, but if this was the real world and they were coming towards us, a critical question would be, do they have common fate? And what I mean by that is, if this person moves forward another 5 meters, is this person still beside them, right beside them? Are they sticking together and moving together? If they are, we're going to think they are together. We're going to group them together. But if this one is actually moving faster than that one, well, actually, either way, if one of them is moving faster than the other, so yeah, they're side by side right now, but if we watched a while longer, one of them would be ahead of the other one. Then we would say, okay, they were just passing at this point. They're not together. If they don't have a common fate, if one of them moves faster than the other, so yes, they're moving the same direction together, but not the same speed, then we will tend to, the grouping disappears. But if they're moving together at the same speed, now they have a common fate, we call it, and we group them together. Okay. So that's a kind of cool principle at play here. This is simple proximity, and I'm just showing you here that this is how sophisticated things get after a while. So even though these three people are oriented the way they are, if we were asked, who belongs together in terms of sort of teammates, we would easily say, okay, this guy and this guy are teammates. The two green shirts are teammates, and they're not a teammate with the blue shirt guy. Well, it's possible this is their goalie. They have different color shirts, but let's keep that aside and let's just say, well, actually they have different sponsors, so this isn't their goalie. But this is the way we just use this. We can very quickly look at this and kind of the brain assumes those two people go together, and that they're different from that. Now, what the heck am I trying to show you here? I don't know. I mean, it could be a recognition thing. This is one of my favorite pictures from when I was young. I'm there. So it could be a question of find Steve. In order to find Steve, you have to kind of make me figure. So, as you're going through, there's all these people you can look at. And as you look at it, they become the focus of your attention and everything else sort of becomes the background. And so when you're looking for me, you're constantly doing that sort of figure ground swap. You're starting with him. No, that's not him. No, I don't think that's him. No, probably not. This is probably about as close of a distractor as you'll get, maybe. No, okay, this is me. Maybe because I'm still doing the peace sign. I've been doing the peace sign for a long time, I guess. There I am. So, it's a very different looking me, but in order for you to see that, you have to pull that out of the background of the images. And so this is a challenge when we go looking, at pictures and stuff in that sense. Okay. One more thing I want to do with Gestalt to tie it back to the previous lecture. Plus, this is a lot of fun. I want to highlight the role that memory is playing. And so let me start by just kind of messing with your head, because it's fun to mess with your head. Okay. So I'm going to do this, and let me just make this a little bigger so that you guys can see it a little bigger. Okay, cool. So this is just PowerPoint, right? Just plain old PowerPoint here, and make it just a little bigger again. Cool. So I'm going to do, I guess, a sort of magic trick, you could say, on you. I want you to look at this and to choose one of these. So first of all, when you look at these, what do you see? Well, we're kind of getting grouping, right? By similarity, these guys all get grouped together. These guys all get grouped together. They look similar to each other. They look similar to each other, but these guys look different from one another. So we see those two lines of things. Now I want you to pick one of these elements. And, right now, these guys are what we call convex, right? They're coming out towards us. It feels like they're coming out towards us. These ones are concave. It feels like it's going away from us. Now, pick one. Keep your eye on it. Okay, whichever one. Ask yourself, is it concave or convex? Is it coming towards me or is it going away from me? Okay, you got that? Picked one? Here we go. Follow it, stay with it, stay with it, stay with it. As I spin it, stay with it. Okay. What happened? Let me do one. I'll pick this one. Okay, this one's I always get the concave and the convex mixed up. I always have to think of the cave, literally. This one's convex, right? It's coming towards me. So that one's convex. So I'm going to watch that one. I'm going to keep my eyes on it and spin it around. And what happens now? Whoa, it is now concave. Right before my eyes. This thing has changed from coming towards me to going away from me. What the heck is happening there? Okay, well, I've got a high-tech demo to show you. What I want to highlight with my high-tech demo is the role that the previous experience in our world has played. So I said in our world because an important part of this demo is that our world tends to be backlit. So in fact, one of the things I'm going to do is turn off the light I sometimes use over there, which is side lighting. Right? Providing a side light. In fact, this light is also providing a side light right now. Let me minimize that. I won't get rid of it, but I'll minimize that. So there's a little less side lighting coming on, and that's because I want this. This is the sunshine. Flashlight. Okay, so this is going to be my sunshine. And now let's consider what happens when the sun, which comes from above, strikes something that's convex. One bowl. So there we go. We have the sun coming from above, striking a bowl. I'm hoping you can see that clearly. And if you look at that, if I ask you, how does the light work now? What are you seeing? What you're probably seeing is quite a bit of brightness on the top of the bowl. So compare this to this. And what you see is brightness on the top of the bowl because the sun hits it, right? But not on the bottom. On the bottom, you're seeing shadow, because the bowl is shadowing it, right? So when something comes towards you, it's light on the top and bottom and dark on the bottom. If we turn this around, it's all changed, right? It's now dark on the top and light on the bottom. The sun is now showing the inside lip of that bowl. High tech or what? Hey, this is what you pay your big tuition for, these fancy demos. Okay, I'm going to turn this off. There we go. So that's the reality of how light works when it hits the bowl. What you're seeing here is the brain turning that backwards. So it has that as an assumption. So I'm just sort of showing you over here that when the light source is at top, if it strikes the top, that's what happens when it's coming towards us. And so when something is more lit on the top than the bottom, it feels like it's coming towards us. When it's more lit on the bottom than the top, it feels like it's going away from us. The reason I'm able to do this magic is because they have, in this case, the light is on the top and the dark is on the bottom. But when I turn this around, that reverses, right? So let's do it. And now the dark for these ones is on the top and the light is on the bottom. Whereas for these ones, now the light is on the top, the dark is on the bottom. And so the stimulus isn't changing, right? It's a two-dimensional stimulus. These three dimensions we're seeing are our brain processing that stimulus. And what we actually see with this demo is what we end up perceiving, how it looks to us, is a function of the input and the specifics of it, where it's dark and where it's light, but also that pre-processing I told you about, or that processing based on previous experience. which is interpreting what it sees. And that's the process that says, oh, I'm seeing light on the top, dark at the bottom. That's what happens when it comes towards you. And so then it's adding that dimension to what we see. And we see it now as a three-dimensional thing going that way. So important now to describe two terms that you're going to run into. Top-down processing versus bottom-up processing. I don't think they're the best terms, but I think now that we've just talked, we can introduce them. By bottom-up, we're referring to that raw processing of the input, of the raw input. So that, whatever light pattern is out there, that strikes our eyes and it starts a processing process. So it sends the information, for example, to primary visual cortex, as we talked about. And that information now has entered our brain. Okay. That we call the bottom up, the sort of environmentally driven stimulation. But very soon after that starts, that other thing I've told you about, the part of the brain that wants to make sense of the input by comparing it to memory, etc., adding things, removing things, everything we talked about in the previous lecture, that starts to get engaged very early. And we call that the top-down influences. What's top mean? I would rather it be the past to present influences or something, or the memory influences or something like that. I think top, they're just suggesting, I don't know what they're suggesting. I'm not even going to try to give you an explanation, but just so that you know, bottom up is that raw processing of the stimulus. Top down are those processes that are trying to figure out what that thing is and using the past to do it. Okay, cool. Now, just one final thing I want to revisit, Gestalt. And we saw it in that previous demo. I kind of suggested to you that the actual thing on the screen is just a two-dimensional thing with, light on the top and dark on the bottom, for example. But what we perceive is a three-dimensional shape coming towards us or away from us. The whole, what we perceive, the whole, is more than a sum of its parts. Its parts were just the light and dark shading, the circle, the raw input. But when the top-down processes now make sense of it, organize it, using their grouping, doing the figure ground thing, what we end up perceiving is more than just those dark and light things. There's been meaning added to it. There's been experience added to it. And in this case, a dimension was added to it. We actually see that third dimension. So that's what the Gestalt was about. How does the magic of perception happen? We know that the eyes are just getting bits and pieces of stuff that's a mess, and yet we have this beautiful whole. How does that whole end up being more than the sum of the parts that went into it? That's what Gestalt psychology was all about. So hopefully with this lecture and with some of the things that you read about it, that will make a whole lot more sense. Okay, gonna leave it there. Bye-bye.